So by the end of next year, it'll make about 2 million artillery rounds a year, which would allow it to fire, say, 5,000 rounds a day, which is a lot less than it wants to fire, but it's enough to keep going.
The other unique thing about this attack was that there may have been a Russian missile that entered NATO airspace, albeit briefly. Poland has blamed Russia for a missile apparently going about 40 kilometers across the border into Poland, which again highlights just how we've become accustomed to something that is very close to escalating into an even more serious situation.
Yeah, and there's no sort of knock-on retaliation, or there's no words of concern really from Poland, their armed forces announcing that Russian missile had entered Polish airspace. They just have to continue to be ultra vigilant, George.
Yes, when you arrive in Poland and Rzeszów, which is the sort of airport that's closest to Ukraine, which is used to transport a lot of the Western military hardware that ends up on the front lines in Ukraine, that's one of the most heavily defended places in the world, second perhaps to the White House, but that's about it. You arrive and the runway's aligned with American air defense systems simply because it is close to the border, and this is not the first time that some of these attacks have spilled over into NATO airspace. I mean, you might remember there was an incident last year where a Ukrainian air defense missile misfired and ended up killing two farmers in Poland, but also more recently Russian attacks on grain storage facilities on the Danube right next to Ukraine's border with Romania, another NATO country, has also seen skirmishes, right on the border of NATO, if not, straying at times into NATO airspace.
Yeah. Look, thank you, George, for keeping us across the latest there in Kyiv. Do take care. That is George Grills, who is the Times' defence and political correspondent, who's in Kyiv. Let's now speak to General Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of the UK's armed forces. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Lots of people will be asking about the resilience of Ukraine and whether there should be a response to this huge air missile attack from Russia. Sir Richard, what is your opinion?
So I think there are two aspects to resilience that we need to be clear about. The first is the resilience of the Ukrainian society as a whole to keep going. They've been at war now for 2 years. They've taken casualties. 18% of the country is occupied by Russia, but there really isn't much sign of Ukraine thinking it can't win or it wants to give up. It's got to find many more soldiers, maybe another 500,000, and that's a challenge from a population of 40 million. The other aspect of resilience, which is just as important, is if Ukraine wants to fight, it has to have the means to fight, and that can only come now from driving up industry in the US and Europe in particular, as well as in Ukraine, because even if Ukraine has all the will in the world to fight, if it doesn't have the weapons and the ammunition, it will simply run out of options. And it's actually the resilience of the West now, our willingness to provide the stuff, that is the bigger question.
Yeah, and this attack, one of the largest scenes since war broke out, will remind Western governments of that. They are somewhat stuck, though. Viktor Orban and Hungary have put a stop, for the moment anyway, to any extra support from the EU. We've got the situation where, Congress haven't approved and for now won't be approving any more funding after the latest tranche from the United States. It is not a problem that is going to be resolved quickly, and I wonder if Russia will be out to take advantage of that.
So Russia's strategy, President Putin's strategy for some time now, has been to wait out the West. He believes that Mr. Trump will be re-elected and the US will then walk away from supporting Ukraine. He also believes that Europe, in the shape of the EU, doesn't have the stomach to pay the, frankly, relatively modest costs of supporting the war in Ukraine. And the evidence you just cited will encourage him. And that's why President Putin probably thinks the advantage in this war, in a small way, is swinging back his way. But the fact is, the EU believes it will overcome the obstacles set by Hungary and indeed individual EU states, which is where the money is. They can individually decide what to do, and the same may apply in US politics as we turn into the new year. And we need to recognise that if you take just the European economy, it's about 15 trillion euros a year, and the Russian economy is about $2.2 trillion a year. So this isn't a question of affordability for Europe. It's a question of leadership and competence and mobilization. It's a question of choice.
And, can there be any solace taken from the pattern so far of, Russia retaliating after significant attacks by Ukraine? We saw this last year, didn't we, when the Kerch Bridge was attacked? There was a significant airborne response from Russia. We saw that overnight, of course, in response to that Russian warship damaged in the Black Sea. So, as you've sort of leaned into already, those are patterns emerging, and they may be of some solace to those concerned about weaponry running out or running low.
Well, only some solace, I think, because both sides are short of ammunition, missiles and shells. But Russia has a massive defense industry. So by the end of next year, it'll make about 2 million artillery rounds a year, which would allow it to fire, say, 5,000 rounds a day, which is a lot less than it wants to fire, but it's enough to keep going. Russia makes about 65 cruise missiles of all types a month, and it's fired 11,000 missiles and drones roughly since the war began 2 years ago. So Russia knows that 2024 is a year of consolidation as it drives up its industry, but this is a competition. So Ukraine doesn't make the missile that destroyed the Russian warship a couple of years. That was made in the United Kingdom. And most of the air defense missiles it fires are coming from the US. So the problem for Ukraine is it needs to drive up its stocks, but it can only do that with its allies binding in behind it. It doesn't control its destiny in the way that Russia does. So solace a bit limited on that point, I think.
And do we know where this sits with the Russian public? I mean, the nature of the attacks overnight, a maternity ward, educational facilities, a shopping mall, multi-storey residential buildings, private homes. I mean, those are deliberate targets. That is a war crime. But I just wonder whether Russian, whether this looks like success to those in Russia, or whether this is being portrayed as success to the electorate in Russia, who will be going to the polls, of course, most likely to re-elect Vladimir Putin once again.
So I think it's very difficult to read, and there are much better Russia experts than me. But I think it's still true that a very large number of the Russian population believe in this war, and they believe in President Putin. They have this sense that Russia should exert essentially imperial influence over its neighbors, as it's long aspired to do, and that it is waging a war against the West, against NATO particularly, and all that we stand for that they reject. And despite the enormous casualties, so perhaps 300,000 killed and seriously wounded over 2 years from a population of 140 million, despite those casualties, and there is some opposition and some dissent, by and large, there's no sense of President Putin feeling that his strategy is at risk, and he is very good at dealing with dissent in his own country.
Yeah, and finally, just a bit of breaking news to get your reaction on, Sir Richard. That is that the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has confirmed that the UK will send air defence missiles to Ukraine.
I think this is really good news. The UK has long set an example to the rest of Europe in the way that we've provided training and ammunition and money. But we should also reflect that what UK industry can do right now is a relatively modest part